There's a really interesting new paper that was just published that's going to change the way a lot of people are thinking about AI. Welcome back to the idea supply chain, where we take a look at where ideas come from and what makes those ideas valuable. Today, I wanted to talk about a new paper that I just saw that was published in Nature. And what it does is it actually shows that AI models trained on synthetic data that they've produced end up collapsing into the model. And the model falls apart, basically. And this is actually something that I am not surprised at all to hear. And in fact, as I was really thinking through the ramifications of this, I realized there's a really tight correlation into what I end up seeing on creator platforms. But so to start off, I want to talk about synthetic data at all because, talk about synthetic data a little bit because I don't think a lot of people actually know what synthetic data is. And as you may have been able to tell from the name, synthetic data is data that is generated. It's created. It's not collected from like how people use it or, what inputs they use. Basically, one of the hypothetical things that a lot of researchers are throwing out there is like, oh, well, we've kind of trained on the whole internet now. What's next? Maybe we can just train on a whole bunch of like fake data that we generated and create all of these use cases and train on that. Turns out that doesn't actually work. And again, I'm not really surprised by this. It actually makes a lot of sense to me because, especially when it comes to human language, there is a lot of the world that gets represented in our language that we use, and the world is constantly changing. And so our language is constantly changing. And, even if you look at just things like slang, there's a whole lot of new slang popping up because, as soon as I say something like no cap or bet, suddenly kids will no longer say that. And so whatever the new, skibbity slang is, it's going to change a lot because as soon as this gets out there, kids are going to be horrified, specifically mine. But no, in all honesty, language does change over time. And, I've actually seen this, as I said, in creator platforms. And the one I really like using as an example is Medium. Medium is a writing platform, if you didn't know. And basically, they pay you based on a percentage of the membership fees for Medium that your readers pay. Now, when Medium first started, they were trying to get new readers on. And so, they're doing like extra sorts of promotion for the writers. They're trying to get a bunch of new readers joining. And so what happened is you have these writers that are, end up making thousands of dollars a month, and they're doing really well on the platform. And what happens then? Well, it turns out that what happens is other people start getting wind of the fact that Medium is paying writers really well, which is good for Medium. They're attracting new writers. Yay, that's what they want. That's what their platform is built on. And so new writers come in, and suddenly there's a lot more competition for this kind of human curation that they're doing. Well, they don't have the human power to continue doing this human curation, and so they replace it with this AI system. And it becomes less valuable, but, things start going. But what happens is actually the audience shifts, because where you start off with writers who are getting readers, you now have writers who are getting more and more writers as their audience. And what do writers want to do on Medium? They want to learn how to make more money on Medium. And so basically you get this self-reflective feedback loop in place, because the people who are successful on the platform are creating content for the people who want to be successful on the platform, which completely ends up overloading the data because these are the people spending the most time on it. And suddenly you're getting away from the preferences of the people who are there to read. And so this ends up ruining the creative cycle. And I think this is exactly what's happening with these AI models. They are basically, the creator and the consumer end up being the same thing. And so you end up collapsing in on yourself as an AI model. And I actually want to take this one step further because I think this is actually a really interesting argument for why we need multiple AI providers. Because by doing that, you end up avoiding this issue where kind of all this data collapses in on itself in these models because you have different models valuing different things. And so there's this constant back and forth. And so when you're actually putting these into systems that are used downstream of the model, so with multiple intermediate layers, what you're doing is you're adding all sorts of external data from the actual world into this. And so you're capturing these changes as they happen, and you're bringing in enough outside fresh data to where these models can continue to learn and get better. And I think what's happening, if you've ever heard the term model drift, a lot of times, like when I was at Copy AI, one of the things we would see is like over time, our like the models we were using and like the fine tunes would end up being like less good over time. They would get worse. And that's a weird thing to say, but I think it has to do with the way people use the models when they don't know how to use like the product, and then they look at kind of the results that they're getting, and they kind of people learn how the platform works and they start optimizing for the platform, so for the specific model they're using, and then suddenly you get kind of this self-reflective feedback loop that ends up making it perform worse over time. Granted, a lot of this is just conjecture at this point. I haven't done in-depth analysis into any of this, but this is really in line with the behaviors I've seen and kind of the results I've seen in a bunch of different platforms. And when you start thinking of companies like AIs, because in a sense, in essence, that's really what they are. They are people, large groups of people in a lot of cases, getting all of this data that they're collecting. They're trying to learn from that data and they're making changes. They're training their models to do things that they believe will end up resulting in the outcome that they want. And what ends up happening is basically, they're learning from the data that they have, but then also the people using the platform are learning from what they're seeing. I think it's the same thing with search engine optimization in a way. You end up with this, these adversarial relationships between like the people optimizing the algorithm to kind of surface the most helpful content. And then you have the people who are spending the most time learning how to get their content surfaced, whether or not it's actually helpful. And so there's this constant battle back and forth. And search gets flooded with a bunch of shit that nobody cares about because it's all people figuring out how to game the algorithm. And I think this is going to end up being a really interesting paper, because I see this like basically the synthetic data in a lot of these cases is the data caused by the implementer of the algorithm, the training of the algorithm, influencing the data that's actually going into the algorithm. And so it ends up being the same effect. So time will tell. Eventually, I would like to do some studies around this, but that's kind of what I'm seeing. And if you want to check out more of this paper, it was published in Nature, as I said. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see if people continue to try to use synthetic data in large chunks, or if it's going to change the approach. And my personal approach is typically I use synthetic data to expand existing data, like not replace it. I don't create entire data sets of synthetic data. But sometimes I put in what I kind of think of as like placeholders in the data. So I basically, fill in some of the gaps in the data that I have to show the AI that there's something that exists there, so that it has to basically account for that. And it's hard to say if this is actually helpful or not, but it's how I think of it. And I tend to get pretty good results when I'm, building out AI workflows, because I've really developed a feel for it over the last few years. So it's been pretty interesting to see kind of how my approach has changed over time as I learn the models and what works and what doesn't. And so again, kind of this self-reflective thing I have to be careful with, but yeah, I do try to constantly bring in new data and bring in external sources. So I'm not constantly relying on what the model is giving me directly. I'm instead, importing expertise from like books, podcasts, articles, transcripts, whatever, so that I can ground whatever I'm trying to do in very specific contexts. And I think that that's really, really helpful. So anyway, that's it for today. Thought you'd find that interesting. I know I did. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.